I am Mac, and I must also give out a shout out to a gentleman by the name of Jason Ashbaugh, who came up with the title for this talk. It was initially entitled a very boring intro to passive DNS. I really liked when he saw the presentation, his take on it, which was getting a little more active with passive DNS, and therefore passive aggressive is how we got there. So a little bit about me. I am a former Army infantryman, so Queen of Battle, and anybody else that knows the response to that can shout out on the channel. I am a Linux enthusiast. I love primarily Red Hat flavors of Linux are my favorite, but that being said, I use all flavors and really like it. And I'm a recovery security analyst and architect from the government sector, the academic sector, and healthcare sectors. And a little bit more about me is I'm a really social person, so I'm not loving quarantine. And there are some folks that work with me now that are in this this channel. There are some folks that have formerly worked with me, and they will tell you that I'm so good at keeping my opinions to myself and hate to talk. But one of my biggest passions is maximizing value in all kinds of tools. So there are a phenomenal set of free tools, and some of the presentations today have done a great job of exercising those. And then there's the ability to take those free tools and with a little bit of spend and a little bit of effort, absolutely squeeze the max out of them. So nothing that I'm going to cover in this presentation today is going to be new or novel. A lot of it is kind of security 101 stuff in some sense, doing some blocking and tackling, but it's with a focus on using DNS and specifically passive DNS and some open source tooling to automate some of that, to increase the visibility and to make it not so tedious. So I'm going to be open sourcing some code probably in the next couple of weeks, actually, on how to get some of this stuff done in Jupyter notebooks, as well as just some straight up Python to do this. And all of what I am talking about today can be done for maybe $1,500, $1,000 to $1,500 a year for a small organization and more. It's not really expensive. And if you could add a part-time security analyst to your team for $1,000 a year, I think that would be considered a huge win. So with that, for those of you who don't know what passive DNS is, it's really just kind of a historical look of how DNS has looked in the past. And the reason it's considered passive is how you collect it, right? We look at traffic going across the wire, we analyze the request, we analyze the response, and then we store it, right? But it isn't actually a passive tool. You can really get very active with it. And what people don't seem to understand is that you can do so much with passive DNS other than, oh, we had an incident. Did we go to this IP address which corresponded to this domain, or how did the domain on this particular attack change over time? You can really actually get out ahead of some things with it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing that I want to kind of talk about is this concept of the LEVENSHTEIN distance. And it's been around for quite a while. And it's really just how you calculate the difference in strings. And you get a LEVENSHTEIN coefficient or LEVENSHTEIN distance, right, when you run this formula. And one of the things that you start to realize is that a LEVENSHTEIN distance of 1 or 2 is very, very dangerous. So if we look at mechanic versus RNECHNIC, right, that's a LEVENSHTEIN distance or LEVENSHTEIN coefficient of 2, where we replace the M with an R and an N. And this is a really common attack, as people have been talking about inside of phishing email, business email compromise. It's replacing that with a lookalike domain that when people are reading really quickly, they see that they were supposed to see mechanic and they saw RN instead. And if you're not using fixed width fonts, it's even harder to detect. So, and if you look at the last one, we'll talk about this one in a little more in depth in a couple of minutes, but that's a LEVENSHTEIN coefficient of 1, where the I has been replaced with an L, right? And that lowercase l kind of looks like a capital I, and people actually confuse that all the time. And they actually respond to these emails and do things that are damaging to the organization. So how do you calculate all these things? How do you discover this stuff? So Marcin Ulikowski out of the Ukraine or Poland, I can't remember. It's on his GitHub site. My apologies. He has written a tool called DNSTwist. It's free, and it uses LEVENSHTEIN and some other techniques to actually find domains which may be similar or dangerous. So it doesn't just use LEVENSHTEIN, it works with some well-known and well-crafted replacement techniques as well. And then it can do all kinds of things like look up whether the domain is registered, and if it is, where it's resolving. But that isn't always just enough. Whether it's resolving, you may need to monitor that for an ongoing attack, right? So one of the best things that his tool can do is give us a great list of domains of which we might be interested in. So a DNS result is really nothing more than an indicator, right? A DNS result in and of itself is not dangerous. It may or may not be suspicious. In general, it's not. It's just an answer. However, it presents us with the ability to add metadata and context around it to make that indicator more interesting and build the fact whether it is dangerous or not. And another thing that I want to point out is when you run DNSTwist or anything else, and you come up with these LEVENSHTEIN algorithms, a non-registered domain is simply nothing more than an opportunity, but it's an opportunity for both sides. It is an opportunity for an attacker to register that domain and attack your organization with. It's an opportunity for your organization to potentially work with the business units and register these domains underneath brand protection mechanisms and either redirect them to your website or, if we go back across the past talks when, Marcus was talking about canary tokens, I mean, you can get attack intelligence. It's really up to the maturity and the capability and the time that your security team has and how you want to make this work. But passiveDNS, added to these results that come out of DNSTwist can really, kind of wring out more value. So I said we talk about this EMAR industry set right now, and I won't be able to see the Discord, but does anybody want to take a guess what the value to an attacker of that I versus the L is? And I'll try and flip back over. Actually, Bryce, if you can you read a couple of the answers if somebody throws in?
Sure, give me a sec.
Here we go. I'm in now. So, and just for time's sake to move on, that was an $11 million replacement. By replacing the I with the L, this attacker was able to milk a subsidiary in the UK of Caterpillar Industries, which is based here in the US, for $11 million. And the interesting thing about that is the domain was registered and being used for more than a year before the attack actually came out. So if somebody had been looking for that, if somebody had been monitoring the changes over passiveDNS, and one of the results from our DNS set is right there. If somebody had been monitoring that and looking for the changes and over time, they would have seen when the mail server actually got stood up much later than when the domain was registered and first started resolving the pieces, and when it started to become significantly dangerous and something that was an intelligence potential for the organization. So why and what for? And one of the things that I want to keep going on in this presentation is why are we going to do what I'm talking about. Why would we spend the time and the money for that? Because we hear all these things that we are supposed to do, but why do we care about it? And so I've broken it down kind of into the SOC and the CISO role, right? For the first part of that is the SOC gains visibility. By running these tools and automating these processes and getting reports to it, right, we gain visibility. And in doing that also, the SOC gains depth. I don't ever think I've talked to anybody that says we had too many SOC analysts or we have just enough SOC analysts, we don't need any more. So being able to add depth to your SOC analysts. And one of the other things that we frequently have a hard time with in the SOC as well is taking these level 1 analysts and doing a lot of internal training. So we send them away to SANS courses, we send them away to other things, which does educate them, but it also takes them out of the fight. And it also doesn't bring them into what the attack on the internal environment starts to look like, right? So if we can automate some of this stuff away and we can start kind of wringing out the little bits of intelligence value that we get from these tools, we can train our SOC staff on our attacks and for a really, really attractive price, right? And then the CISO understands that they're getting proactivity out of this, right? They did not learn that this domain existed after the $11 million went across the wire and they're paying another $2 million for an incident response company to come in and remediate this and hire a financial services firm to potentially try and go and claw some of that money back, right? And then the other part that they get is growth. So when that CISO goes back in front of the board, when that CISO goes to the CTO or the CIO or whoever they report to, they're able to show a set of maturity in the SOC team and the security team as a whole. These level 1 analysts are receiving internal training. We're receiving, or we're being more proactive in our approach of how to do this, and that also helps potentially drive budget as well. So this internal external view, right? I can potentially dump my DNS zone if my network team or the team that controls the DNS records will allow it, and I can see what my DNS zone looks like, right? But what does your DNS zone look like outside of your sphere of influence? And how would you go about making that determination? So would you need to go set up 20 or 30 VPSs around the world and continuously be doing lookups against your DNS server for names and how these things are resolving? It would be extremely expensive, very time consuming, right? And the other part of that is when you do that, you are also only looking for the things that you think that you know about. So one of the things that passiveDNS could do for you is look for all the things that that go across the wire in the wild, right? So how does your customer actually use DNS against your site or for the usage of your site? Those requests and responses get collected as they go across the wire, right? But the other interesting thing that we can see when we get outside of the sphere of influence is potential rogue states or hostile entities to your company, right? So if you get into, if your company denounces something that happens to a rogue state or a hostile regime, they may try and take action inside of their sphere of influence, and their sphere of influence may be larger than what you read or know about. So are you starting to see DNS queries and answers that don't match what you expect when you start looking at passiveDNS? And I talked to somebody about this not long ago, and they said, oh, but Mac, see, there's not really a problem because, we support DOH, and that's how we want everything to start going. So DNS over HTTPS is going to fix all of this for us. Like, this isn't really a problem anymore. And I kind of have to laugh to that, and that's a whole different side conversation, and understanding that DNS over HTTPS is a technical solution to a political problem. But the long and short of that is, if you think that hostile regimes, rogue states, well-placed and well-funded attackers, whether they're state-sponsored or not, will not spend money to try and squash DNS over HTTPS and can't squash DNS over HTTPS, go do some more reading on that. So we get some super quick wins out of looking at this. We get a perspective. We get a perspective from both inside of our organization and outside of our organization. And sometimes we get a little more perspective than we want, and we'll get to that here in a minute. The SOC team gains some capability, which is they can free up time and resources spent on trying to build tools, trying to dump copies of the zone file and match up answers. They can free that time up and start looking at those reports with level 1 analysts and teaching those level 1 analysts to understand the differences in them and what's good versus bad, and then the bad be taken up. And you can actually bring the level 1 analyst that wouldn't normally handle an incident because you've got extra time now into the fold to handle that. The CISO again gets that same perspective, but the other part that the CISO gets is they get integration. So we have farmed out DNS to the cloud, just like we have everything. And there are a number of things that exist in our DNS that are very interesting. And by understanding what our DNS zone looks like and responds like outside of our organization, your CISO and other management can work with marketing teams and other teams inside of the organization to actually integrate. And we had this talk actually in the Blue Team channel earlier this week and a number of other places about how sometimes security's default answer of no, or frequently security teams' default answer of no is as much their downfall as it is their success of trying to defend the environment. Sometimes you have to realize that the business is going to do what the business is going to do, and there's a risk decision made. So if you can integrate and partner with folks on how this happens, you actually potentially have a better chance of gaining additional visibility that you want and getting compliance and being able to say no when you really need to say no. So split horizon DNS, right? It is super useful. It is the concept that bind views is based on, right? I want a homogeneous naming structure to my DNS. And inside my organization, we have a set of domain names. But because I'm inside my NAT, and because that NAT doesn't have publicly routable IPs, I need my DNS to answer with mail.myorg.com with a 10 series address or a 192.168 address, any of the RFC 1918 space. But when that happens outside of the organization, I need a public set address where the load balancer or the SSL offload or the firewall and the NAT appliance can do everything that it needs to do to, properly bring it into the internal resource. So we run a split horizon DNS. This is nothing new, and it allows disjoint networks to receive differing DNS answers based upon where they're being asked the question from and maintain the common naming infrastructure. However, it is frequently misconfigured. It is frequently set that it is all in one zone, or the zone misanswers at a number of times, and all of a sudden an attacker can query your DNS and they start seeing the inside of it. Well, what can we do with this? And how do we use this? Well, we can look for these results in passive DNS that answer inside of the RFC 1918 space. And if you look at the example that I've got on the screen there, it's the _MSDCS record, right? Which at 10.20.30.40, which is an entertaining IP to run that on. But that being said, that is their domain controller. So this is a semiconductor company that actually has their domain controller's internal private record listed in public DNS somehow. And when this happens, it provides attackers for a roadmap into your environment. But it's not just a roadmap. If we look for well-known vulnerable services, whether it's out-of-date domain controllers or whether it's VoIP servers or any other known internal resource that publishes common commonly set DNS records, we can look for those RCEs. We can look for them as a place to gain a foothold or do a privilege escalation attack, well known. So a domain controller is just one of the many different services. So you can establish automated processes to look for this. Run a passive DNS query against your domain space. Understand we see these records that come in the RFC 1918 space. One of the unfortunate parts about this is you can never pull that record back, right? It'll be in passive DNS data sets and it'll be in attackers' data sets for perpetuity. But it gives you a roadmap of understanding where you need to change and what your baseline footprint is on the internet. So the SOC, by automating these processes, again, recovers time and then gets a really high quality alert. It does concern me if my Ceph controller or my Ceph monitor's internal IP address is leaking publicly. First of all, I probably don't want my Ceph monitor even having a public DNS name, but more often, I don't want the attacker to get a foothold in where some of my critical data is stored. The CISO starts to build a set of reliability in this. We can reliably look at what our our internal footprint that leaked to the external world looks like and make changes. And then we can change that. And once we establish a baseline, whether we didn't have it or we did have it and we've made changes to it, we can reliably and repeatably look and determine that what our RFC exposure was, or 1918 exposure was, is no longer. So shadow IT or rogue IT, or I don't know, I've heard a different, so many different names for it, I can't keep track of them all now, but it's really just services obtained by users or groups within your organization that aren't sanctioned by either policy or sanctioned or permitted by policy to be used and installed on workstations, right? So this may be things like Slack. This may be things like analytics for your website, right? And when I say the word sanctioned, what I mean by that is sometimes we have a policy that says, in an organization that says you can't use something, but we know it's being used and we don't do anything that's being used, and our policy becomes ineffective, and we are effectively saying, hey, we'll let you use this and we're sanctioning this even though it's outside of the policy. So we need to be careful when we look at things that way. But we have 1,000 different service providers, right? If we look at this slide, there are so many service providers that will offer any number of services, right? So all of the capabilities that you are willing to offer your internal customers or your external customers are probably, they're not probably, they are offered by some other as a service organization, right? And these providers focus on making integration into your environment as seamless as possible. So they have engineers that have experience in avoiding your security team. They have processes and tutorials online to make it so that all somebody has to do is run a script somewhere and get this. They have these documentations because their business depends on it, right? So if you make it really difficult for the organization to have a chat client internally that to allow a non-email based communication, if you make it difficult to have VoIP communications, if you make it difficult for the marketing team to get the analytics that they want to complete their job, they will bypass you and obtain this. And if your organization is of any size, the security team probably doesn't have access to the corporate card logs to figure out who's paying for what. However, if you go partner with finance, by the way, to look for certain things on corporate expense accounts, you may want to see these things, right? So somebody may have gone and purchased their own Zoom because they didn't like the fact that your company was using Cisco WebEx. And sometimes you can do stuff about it and sometimes you can't. But one of the things you want to do is know. And oftentimes you can look for little hints and pieces. This happens again for the fact that we say no, we don't partner, and oftentimes it happens because your IT department is not adequately staffed, right? So your users now want something, but we're not going to be able to provide that service for 6 months. We're not going to be able to provide that service for a year, but we'll get it to you. And that's when these things start to happen to go around you. So we can hunt for these things, right? So we can look at our SPF records. So email service providers, MailChimp, SendGrid, Constant Contact, there are a number of them that happen, right? They are very, very powerful for marketing teams. They're very good for the business, but they can be incredibly dangerous. I did work earlier at a previous position, an incident where a huge number of customers of a financial institution ended up getting malware because the financial institution was using an email service provider. The credentials for this email service provider were phished, and then an attacker used that to send a marketing looking email to the customers, at which there was a download in, they got malware, it was a banking Trojan, whole other things, right? And if you look, and the interesting thing is the security team at that institution, it was not large, didn't even know that their marketing team was using Constant Contact. But they could have, because and this is not the organization, but in this organization's SPF record was and include the constantcontact.com, right? So you can use records like this to go and hunt for potentially dangerous sets, right? What about live chat or analytics, right? Those things need to be put in your DNS as well. And many times, even some of the Google Analytics stuff requires some CNAME records inside of your DNS. So go look for things like live chat. Now, this is Kimberly Clark's test server. I'm sure they probably knew that it was up. But that being said, when you look at these things, you can look for keys like live chat and your inside of your domain record zones. So the SOC gains extra insight. One of the other pieces that they can potentially gain from that is an intelligence set, an intelligence of what the adversary can use against them, such as email service providers, as well as the fact that they gain intelligence about what things are being used inside of the organization. The CISO gets to show progress in the fact that we're no longer waiting for the Constant Contact account to get owned that didn't have a second factor on it. The CISO knows that these things are out and being used, and whether they can stop it or not, they can partner back with that business unit, and they can integrate again back in that business unit, and they can do things like, hey, we would like you to put two-factor on it, and we want to verify or make some kind of way to understand that you're not using the same password on your Constant Contact account that you are in your corporate account. The other insights and understanding that you get is when we say that everything is an insider to an organization, or most threats are insider threats, i.e. phishing and spear phishing and insider threat malware that came through an email. One of the other things that we don't understand is that oftentimes our vendors are also insider threats to us. We share networks, we share records, we share access with our vendor, right? So we gain insight to the fact that an attacker does not necessarily have to attack us to gain access, right? And we look at Target as a great example in the fact that, you know, the Target breach went from HVAC vendor to PCI environment, right? So we as a team can cast a wide net, right? And I talked about integrating with other teams, but your compliance team, which often has an adversarial relationship between a security team, is a really, really important asset, right? So we can also fold them into this passive DNS thing to help make a security team's job easier, right? A well-run compliance program enhances your security and allows for better messaging from your team to the organization. And it generally drives budget. So if you as a security team are having trouble getting budget, because the fact that a compliance team deals with a regulatory mandate and a mandate that has not just a reputational or an impact to reputation, but an impact to the bottom line of a company, you can potentially gain extra funding, right? And help share those things with them. If an organization fails at the InfoSec game, they're going to take a hit and make the Brian Krebs's site, right? They're gonna find the papers. They may get a news story on it, right? But if an organization fails at compliance, sometimes the officers will go to jail, and in most cases there are significant fines. You can recover from a breach. There's oftentimes no recovery from a fail at compliance. So partner with these folks, integrate it. What information does your third party's compliance declaration contain? So from a security team, when we partner with that, we get to find out who our third parties are. But if we also work with the compliance team to give them access to passiveDNS, we can actually help that third party the compliance team verify the data on that third party. If that third party says, hey, here's the IP that we always use, we're behind this, so when you go to mycompany.myretirementprovider.com, you're always going to go through this and you're going to get this record. It's offloaded through Akamai or whatever happens, but this is how you go. And your company looks at that with passiveDNS and realizes, well, that's not always the case because we can see it flipping between multiple things here. Then you can see that your third party isn't actually providing you accurate attestation on those forms, right? So you can use some of these other techniques with your compliance team to actually verify these sets. And the other part that your compliance team gets is when they go back to the other vendor, they can make another vendor the bad guy. You can make open source context or any other provider that provides this data set the bad guy and say, well, I've got proof here that that is not always the way you declare it. One of the other best uses of a compliance team time is looking at passive BGP data or historical BGP data. I'm not sure there's the greatest term for it, but either way, it's BGP. And for those of you that don't know what BGP is is the way that the big internet routes everything, right? And people often say, oh, we don't use BGP in our environment, so we don't have an issue with that. Well, yeah, everybody uses BGP in their environment because it's the layer above what you think of. Oh, well, this is my IP range, but it has to be broadcast by an autonomous system so that the internet as a whole knows how to route traffic, right? So why is this dangerous? Well, BGP has little to no security around it. So one of the things that I can do is just claim to be the owner of a particular prefix on the internet and start broadcasting. And in most, many, if not most, if not all cases, routers will eventually pick that up and go, oh, okay, I can route some data here. Now, it causes all kinds of interesting things in the meantime while different ASs are fighting over the broadcast of that. But one of the things that makes it most dangerous is if you broadcast all of your IP space as a /16 or as a /20, if that's what your organization has, I could just broadcast a /24 and we will no longer fight over that IP space because the most specific route wins, right? And at that point, when I get a more specific prefix, I gain your traffic. So why is this dangerous? If we look back, there were a couple of Bitcoin exchangers that lost, and I can't remember whether it was they lost $19 million in 14 minutes or they lost $14 million in 19 minutes. Either way, it doesn't matter. It was a lot of money in a very short amount of time. And the attack had been going for quite a while. So they had tried to socially engineer Amazon's Route 53 to make DNS changes to these Bitcoin exchangers. And Amazon customer service reps and their processes did a really good job of protecting against this social engineering. And at each time they tried something different, it was shut down. So basically, these attackers knew and recognized that there was a large prefix for Amazon's Route 53 being broadcast by Amazon as a whole. So they went and they broadcast a more specific prefix and they hijacked Route 53 DNS. And once they had the Route 53 records. They had established the DNS records for the Bitcoin exchangers that they were interested in, and all of a sudden the traffic went to the attacker. And Amazon was eventually able to get back control of the DNS. The attack eventually stopped, but it was too late. The problem with this is people say, is it preventable? Well, there are some theories about how to secure the BGP space, but if we look back, we've still got providers on the internet that are passing RFC 1918 addresses across BGP boundaries. So getting everybody to participate in this and it being reliable is basically non-existent at this point. So BGP is the Wild West. But it's also a really good way for your compliance teams and your security teams to be back on vendors and to do selection and risk assessment and all the things that the CISO and the security organization as a whole, maybe not the SOC team, but the security organization as a whole is responsible for. So there are sources of BGP data, and our company is actually one of them, right? So what do we get out of this, right? We get accuracy. We get to attest or state that the data that was given to us on the attestation forms by third parties and other vendors is actually accurate. And therefore, we're in compliance. And if something happens to those folks, we can see that, not offload responsibility, but we can show that we did our due diligence and what we knew about them. The CISO gets cost savings. You could potentially put a team on the ground for every vendor and do an internal IT audit, right? And by the way, these same compliance people are also often in charge of looking at and verifying documents on mergers and acquisitions, right? So you can put a team on ground to try and verify all this, but it's a lot cheaper to just be able to run a passive BGP or a passive DNS query at it. And the other part that the CISO starts to get is sleep. So we talked about shadow IT and we talk about vendors, and I've talked to a number of CISOs, and one of the things that they all talk about is one of their sources of losing sleep is the fact that the vendor that they have no ability to control the security posture of, no ability to control access in and out of that vendor's environment is a potential major source of a breach. That M&A, when we start folding people in and we didn't understand the entirety of the risk that we were pulling on that, we didn't understand that they were using cloud services to log all of their logs for their testing and development set. And they were logging them in plain text, and therefore admin usernames and passwords are in the clear, ready to be stolen. It's those kinds of things that keep them up at night. So the CISO gets to sleep a little bit better, understanding that they know what the risk is across the broader organization. So those are just some basic blocking and tackling things that we can do. And we can automate all of these things. And like I said, I'm going to open source a number of pieces of code in the following weeks to help you get this done. You don't have to have a subscription to passive DNS or passive BGP to do all of them. But for sure, an inexpensive basic subscription to be able to run some small number of queries to do verification is very helpful. And for, like I said, as little as $1,000 to $1,500, you can add a part-time analyst, which is going out. And by the way, never forgets to run that, right? We schedule these things as cron jobs, so the report never gets forgotten to be run. So. Again, I want to thank the DerpCon organizers. I've watched them in the channels and talked with them over the past weeks. They've worked really hard and busted it to get this thing off the ground, and it's been great. I want to thank the other sponsors to this, because obviously running conferences aren't free, and they've helped offset it so that it is free for the attendees. Jason Ashbaugh, again, for giving me that title, and I want to thank the people who actually showed up here and took time out of their Friday afternoon to sit here and listen to what the speakers have to say. And with that, that is my contact information. feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you have about this. You can hit us up in the sponsors channel. I've got some other colleagues that are also inside the channel that will help answer any of the questions that may come up. And if you send an email to stickers@oscontext.com, over the coming weeks, I'll even get some of these. Oh, I should have had one ready to go, but these high quality OS context stickers out to your physical mailing address for you to enjoy. And with that, that's all I have.
Awesome, thank you very much. I can vouch for the giant pile of stickers Mac has. I've seen some of it, and it is large. The pandemic definitely hit their ability to distribute those, so hit him up and get them out of his basement. We do have one question for you, Mac,
Sure.
from Tom Dunn. Are there any services that can monitor a company's DNS from an external perspective that you would recommend?
Yeah, ours. We can monitor your DNS, and not just monitor your DNS. We can monitor the records that match across that, right? Which really in turns allows your organization to monitor that, so you can utilize the API of a passive DNS provider to look at that. The problem with trying to monitor your DNS as a whole is you can use certain records to monitor performance of your DNS and make sure that your DNS is available. But if you don't control, like the security team does not control the adding or removing to DNS records, and in lots of organizations, the network team or the systems administration team handles the DNS servers, then in that case, you don't know all the records you're looking for, right? So one of the things that we frequently do in that external, out looking in type perspective, right, is we will schedule a search with a client on a regular basis to say run every 24 hours or run every 12 hours. And it says, hey, give me all, and this is part of the code that I'm going to open source, give me all of the records that you know about on my particular domain, right? And it returns a value. Well, sometime later, we run that search again, and we can either compare the hashes, we can do a number of things to compare whether they're the same or not. But then when we detect a change in that, one of the things that we can do is then alert the security team that something has changed, right? Whether it's our MX records, whether it's our, a text record like our SPF record has changed, or whether we just stood up new infrastructure to the world to see. And one of the things that level 1 analyst can do is go, oh, okay, I see that there was a change review board form submitted. It went through a security architecture review. It went through a security compliance review. It's got all the processes, and the appropriate signature signed off on. And as such, that's not a really concerning thing that record came online. It was all expected. Or, nobody in the security team knows about that. There's no change request on it. There's no Arch review on it. There's no, compliance review on it, and nobody knows about that, right? So it's a really easy way to do that. It is expensive and complicated to try and do it on your own because you need to go out and basically try and dump your zone to external entities. And by allowing your zone to be transferred to external entities, you allow all kinds of other potential badness to happen. So the best way to do it, the cheapest way to do it, the most efficient way to do it, in my opinion, in my experience, before being a vendor of passive DNS, is by passiveDNS.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. I don't think there are any other questions, and thank you for your talk. That was great.